Sacred attention therapy is an approach to liberation. The first liberation is from the conditioned self, psychology of early life. The second liberation is from the realization of the true nature, the fulfillment of oneself as a personality. And the third liberation is the liberation into the life of spirituality and spiritual practice. Sacred attention therapy, or SAT, is a meta-psychology because it embraces not only the physical, emotional, mental and energetic aspects of the human being, but also the spiritual and the transcendental. Therefore, it is uniquely placed to be an applied psychology through counselling and psychotherapy in the 21st century, in which human beings are more complex than ever before.
Welcome to the first in a series of interviews with Richard Harvey, psychospiritual psychotherapist and spiritual teacher, to discuss the Hsueh discourses. My name is Rob Meager. I'm an interfaith minister. I lead a spiritual ministry initiative in Ottawa, Canada called Spiritual Guidance, and I've been a student of Richard Harvey's work since 2012. Today's interview will discuss the Hsueh discourses as a whole. This series is a 5-part lecture series, and each subsequent interview in the interview series will explore in more detail each one of the lectures in the Hsueh discourses. The Hsueh discourses manuscripts are contained in an ebook entitled Bodhi Ocean, which is forthcoming through the Sacred Attention Therapy website. Bodhi Ocean is one of a trilogy of 3 ebooks, each containing 14 lectures, totaling 42 lectures. The first ebook is entitled Moksha Dawn, the second ebook is entitled Dharma Sky, and the third ebook, as I've mentioned, is entitled Bodhi Ocean and is currently in production. Again, all ebooks are available through the books page of the Sacred Attention Therapy website. You can also listen to the full recording of many of these lectures in this series on the lectures page of the Sacred Attention Therapy website. And lastly, you can view many other interviews on the videos page or on our YouTube channel. The URL for our website is www.sacredattentiontherapy.com, and on our website you can click on the YouTube channel icon to view our YouTube channel. And now I'd like to provide you with a little bit of background about Richard Harvey. Richard is a psychospiritual psychotherapist and spiritual teacher. His work emerged out of the human potential movement of the 1970s. He trained with many teachers in humanistic and transpersonal approaches. He is the founder of Sacred Attention Therapy, a radical new approach to inner work for the 21st century that proposes a 3-stage model of human awakening. Richard is the author of Your Essential Self and The Flight of Consciousness, among many other publications. He works with people all around the world, and his forthcoming book is entitled Your Sacred Calling. And it's now my pleasure to welcome Richard Harvey. Greetings.
Hello, Robert.
Nice to be with you.
And you.
To discuss the Hsueh discourses. And Richard, this series of discourses feels different to me compared to all the other lecture series to date in terms of their inspiration. First, the Hsuan discourses are dedicated to the Hsuan movement. And second, they masterfully take a Taoist or a Taoist story and relate it to a passage from another spiritual tradition before relating and extending the themes to your sacred spiritual model of human growth and development. So it feels to me like the inspiration alone is, might I use the word, much more sophisticated than other lecture series that have come before it. And I'd like to begin by asking you first, tell us a little bit about the Hsueh movement. What was the Hsueh movement?
I didn't find a lot of information about Hsueh. There's very little that I could even find on the internet, but I had first heard of this somewhat remote Taoist sect in a book that I have had forever. It's a little thin book published by Watkins Publishing or something in England. I bought it in a little shop which was literally down the lane from where I lived in the mid-70s, and I always thought it was wonderful, and it's called something like Ancient Wisdom of the Taoists or something. It's a sort of selection. Now, in my early days of my own personal therapy, I was very drawn to Taoism as well as to some degree to Zen. And over the years, I would meet people who themselves had a leaning towards Taoism, and they were inevitably people who were very important for me in my own growth and development. And the kind of feeling post-60s, mid-70s that was going on at that time resembled very closely this sketch we have of the Hsueh sect, which is to say they were involved in nature. They would sit around, meditating or talking or sharing or whatever. And this was very like the early days of the so-called growth movement in England, and I think on the west coast of America at that time, which was that it was very loose, that there were guides and therapists and counselors and people roaming the land, so to speak. It really felt like this even in England to me. And they would gather groups together, and we would sit around, and we would play guitar, and we would sing songs, and then we would talk about feelings, and then we'd cry, and then we'd fall apart, and we'd come back together. And so when I happened upon this Hsueh thing, I thought, wow, this is like something from nearly 3,000 years ago that I feel very powerfully I participated in. So if there were anything, such a thing as reincarnation, which there isn't, if there were, and if we could just dally in that level of consciousness for a second, I was surely there. You were surely there. It was a place where people that we know would have been gathered in some way. So I just felt a resonance with Hsueh. And the beauty and the mystique of it all, the mysticism of it all, of this early, somehow Taoist movement that's not attached to a book, certainly, or dogma or indoctrination of any kind. And that I feel in the center of myself is the case. And when I happened upon it, just last thing to say about all of these 42 lectures are a gift to me. They come. And yet with this one particularly, I could feel the meeting of the human divine together. Because I thought, wow, these are the talks that in a sense I always wanted to give. Because they resonate through Taoism and mystical Christianity and the Gospels and Martin Buber, so therefore the Hasidim, all these different things, Changzu, and everything comes in as a single resonance through many different paths and many different times and many different cultures. And I love that as a feeling of the totality, or a feeling of timelessness and something beyond culture. So I was very aware in the preparation of these lectures that the human part of me that was so enthused met the divine that was somehow just dropping these teachings in, even at the same time.
Now, you've partly answered and intuited my next question, if not completely answered. And I wanted to ask, where did you even conceive of the idea to take a Taoist story related to a passage from another tradition and then back as kind of a trilogy to your teachings? How did this idea even come to you?
Because there's nothing individual or separative in truth. Therefore, wherever you pick it up, in Judaism, Taoism, Zen Buddhism, mystical Christianity, American Indian teachings, African mythology, religion, wherever you're going, north, south, east, west, in the middle, you hear the same thing once you've come through the variety and the diversity. And I'm pretty sure of that, because that's how it was for me. I think that's how it was for Joseph Campbell, for example. I think that's how it was for people who've looked momentarily into comparative spiritual paths and religions, and then said, well, really, it's just no point, because it's like looking at a bunch of maps of the same place. I mean, in the end, if you really want to go to any one of these, you only need a good map. You don't need to study 20, 25, 30, 100 different maps of getting to the same place. And that's what it looks like. There was a time in my early life I was very interested in comparative approaches. I nearly wound up in university doing comparative religions. I was interested in Ninian Smart's work, The Religious Experience of Mankind. It's a wonderful book. It's a fascinating book. But of course, it goes on forever, because any truth that arises is expressed in a million different ways. And eventually you say, well, one will do. Nonetheless, these discourses were a nice way of pointing towards that and kind of reminding us all, I'd like to think, of something I stated in The Flight of Consciousness, which is, in a sense, you don't have to be partisan, or certainly not bigoted or prejudiced about a path. All paths ultimately are pointing in the same direction towards God.
I want to take the opportunity to talk about each of the sets of stories, because each lecture weaves two stories, the Taoist story and a story from another spiritual tradition, before blending it and bringing in your own teachings. Now, with the first lecture, Penetrating Wisdom, we have the story of Huang Ti, and then from the Upanishads, Carrying Fuel. Can you tell us a little bit about the story of Huang Ti and Carrying Fuel?
Well, the one I remember best is the Upanishad story of Carrying Fuel, because I don't know about you in your ministry, but in my practice, it's a ubiquitous issue. And the issue of carrying fuel, which I think is my title for that story, because it's the part that I'm really interested in. What happens in this rather mysterious story is that the pupil returns to the master, whose name I can't remember now, but he always brings fuel along with his intention to learn a deeper level of the teaching. And each time the master has dispensed with him and said, well, he teaches him this and says goodbye, so to speak. So it seems, although I've looked into this and I can't find exactly what this fuel is he's meant to be bringing. Is it coal? Is it flowers? Is it wood? I don't know what it is. But it clearly is symbolic of, I'm not satisfied with this level. I want to go further. And when you work with people psychospiritually, I think you've got to keep a careful eye on this fuel notion, which is to say somebody can want, can wish, can intellectually say to you, I want the deeper teaching. It's happened in my practice many times. They're not actually prepared for it. They don't even really want it. They think they want it. You see, yeah. So you know what I mean. And so you've got to look for fuel. And fuel in this case means intention, it means motivation, it means application and consistency. And there's a lot to say about what it means. In the end, you intuit it somehow. And so this was very dear to my heart, this idea of carrying fuel.
Now, the second lecture is entitled Transcending Separation. And it takes the Taoist story of the empty boat and perhaps the Christian teaching around the Jesus dictum of turning the other cheek. What was the story of the empty boat, and how did it relate to this Christian teaching of turning the other cheek?
They're both about how we respond to insult, aren't they? They're both about name calling, or perhaps even an assault on form. In other words, what do you do when somebody calls you stupid, or of course, hits you, or there's an emotional, energetic, or physical assault on form, and what actually happens inside you. And I did the other day, there is a lovely interview with Krishnamurti and some quite young children, maybe a very appropriate age for this question, maybe 10, 12, that kind of age. And he's really examining this question with them, and it's so appropriate for this time of life. What happens when somebody insults you? Have a look at it sometime. It's really good. It's on YouTube, and he examines it, and each of the kids says something or other, of course, and then he goes a little deeper and he goes a little deeper. And what he's trying to help them to do is to find the part of them that isn't affected by the insult, and therefore distinguish that from this brittle, defensive, aggressive, vulnerable part of them, which is, after all, at that time, in process of becoming, pre-adolescence. What happens, and it's very important, isn't it, for the world today, is when we're insulted or hurt in some way, physically, emotionally, energetically, by another person, we take it personally out of self-importance. And that sense of self-importance is in process of creation, in a sense, before, but most pivotally around this age of 12. Just around puberty, shall we say, before we enter into a place of ideological setness, when we adopt a position in thought, which happens during the teenagers. So in the wonderful, one of my favorite stories of all time, The Empty Boat, the idea is, you're in your boat. Your boat is kind of, maybe it's the ego, maybe it's your human vehicle. And the punchline, so to speak, from the comic Chang Tzu, who's such a humorist, is if another boat hits your boat, you get angry only if there's someone in the boat. Because if there isn't somebody in the boat, it's like, oh, what the heck, it's an accident. And then, of course, he brings it back to you and says, how about you occupy your boat without being in it? Which, as usual, is a wonderful challenge from Chang Tzu, of course.
They're both beautiful stories to talk about what the title of the lecture is transcending, overcoming separation. They're beautiful, beautiful metaphors and stories. Now, the third lecture is Locating Destiny. And the Taoist story that is employed is that of the sacred tortoise. And again, a Christian teaching around the Gospels and the temptation of Christ. Again, how do these two stories, the sacred tortoise and the Gospel's temptation of Christ, come together in this lecture, Locating Destiny?
You have to, the temptations of Christ. I mean, I know that this is a controversial one, and I'm involved in it at the moment, but let's make this clear from the outset. My understanding of Christ is that he shows us and he demonstrates compassionately what it is to be a human being. If you follow your potential and capacity and spiritual destiny, the very possibility then for the human collective is to be sacred, divine, and spiritual. And just to make it very clear, I am not coming from a point of view in which Christ is the Son of God in some exclusive way, and this has been apparent to me from as long as I can remember, that it has become a fetish of dogma and indoctrination to consider Jesus, the person, as the Christ, rather than Jesus Christ as a spiritual master who demonstrates to us how to become spiritually realized. So the temptations, alongside the tortoise story, of course, what we go through in a human life, in terms of the seductions towards power and misuse of the human life, with all of the things that in a sense we face every day, be they greed or power over other people or power over one other person, or any kind of self-aggrandizement, any of the seductions that are born out of fear and desire. And of course, Jesus shows through the metaphor of this story what we do. What we do is we refuse, hopefully, and sometimes, of course, we get it wrong or we are tempted, in which case, by definition, we lose touch with our sacred spiritual self.
The penultimate lecture, the fourth of 5, is entitled Spiritual Baptism. And it takes the story of the useless tree, it's a beautiful story, and Martin Buber's Itch and Do. Now, I hadn't been familiar with the Martin Buber story. I had heard of the useless tree story in other forms, because I think it's been borrowed many times over. But what are these two stories? And again, how do they come together in the context of spiritual baptism?
Spiritual baptism, again, we tend to think in terms of the story of John the Baptist and the idea that John the Baptist baptized with water and the one who comes after will baptize with fire. And this is a lovely metaphor for something which is, of course, an internal reality. It's not actually something out there, regardless of whether there's a helpful ritual or not, that may be enacted, that may invoke this spiritual reality whereby the spiritual energy system is anointed, or should we say energized. We could consider, for example, the chakra system. And I'm not sure whether that was introduced in these lectures, I think not. But we could, for example, look at that in terms of the movement through the different lotus flowers to the Sahasrara here at the top, and then this descent following the ascent of the energies. And the what's the second story?
Martin Buber's Itch and Do.
Is that Martin Buber's book is something that's affected me a long time. My very first therapist and spiritual guide was very strong on Buber because it meant a different kind of meeting. It means I and you, and Buber is at pains to explain the objectified other you as opposed to the I and you, which are, so to speak, the same, where I see you not as a separate entity, but as us in our collective humanity, but also in the sameness of consciousness. Mm-hmm. So although it's a different language, the Buber, having background in Judaism, in particular interest in mystical Judaism or the Hasidic way, is able to speak about a quality of meeting where I don't have to put this, whatever this is, between I and the other. And the relevance of this is in the baptism of water and then fire of these elements. What is released is and again in the Eastern or the Hindu or the chakra system, this would be the knowledge of the Sahasrara, where we connect with the divine. Suddenly everything's divine, so to speak. So it's not as if we're lots of different people. But rather we are all one. So this is the result of baptism.
Okay. Now, in the couple of minutes we have left, I want to talk briefly about the last lecture in the series, The Ocean of Stillness. And you work with the story of the Nameless Tao and the legend of Bodhidharma. Can you tell us a little bit about the Nameless Tao and the legend of Bodhidharma?
The absurdity of of spiritual teaching, and the most wonderful and opening sentence of the Tao Te Ching is the Tao that can be named is not the eternal Tao. You cannot actually speak of the truth. As soon as you do, it's now you brought the stars down from heaven, as it were, and now you're merely talking about them. And so the wonderful absurdity about spirituality, and you can see now why fetishes and literalization and concretizing and all of this takes place in terms of secular religion or exoteric religion or teachings in terms of dogma and indoctrination, is that it is absolutely absurd. You cannot organize spiritual truths. You can organize religion because religion is organized anyway. I'm using religion in the modern sense. I mean, the word itself is surely sacred as the binding that we have as human beings to God, to divinity. It's a wonderful word. But by now I think we have to use it in the way we think of it, which is an organization of the often chaotic, certainly irrational, certainly unpredictable divine spiritual path. So these two come together because the Tao that can be named is not the eternal Tao, reminds us always that as we're speaking, the silence between the words, the delivery of the words, the presentiment, the posture, the whoever it is, this is at least as important. It's more than important than the words themselves. So the words in the end are merely poetry. I mean, they're just a way of describing the sunset. Oh, it's lovely, it's red and yellow, and it's blah, blah, blah. But that's not the sunset, it's just the description. So that's the opening line of the Tao Te Ching. And then, of course, Bodhidharma is just so wonderful because he doesn't care at all. Bodhidharma is the Zen patriarch who brings Zen to China and all of this, and then meets this fellow who has kind of tried to organize the teaching by setting up temples, and he's the emperor, as I recall, isn't he? And he clearly intends to meet a guy of great import who merely insults him. So we're kind of back to the empty boat or whatever now. And in another story, which I don't think we used here, he is asked, what is the essence of Zen? Do you know this one? And Bodhidharma, the supreme patriarch of the only Zen teacher, puts his sandal on his head and goes running off. It's just wonderful. It's completely irreverent, as Zen often is, as Taoism often is in the stories. And it really says, don't try and limit this thing to teachings or dogma or indoctrination, because you won't do it. You can't even reduce it to words.
Beautiful introduction, Richard. I look forward to diving into them, and when we come together the next time, we'll take the opportunity to look more intently at the first in the series, and that is Penetrating Wisdom.
I look forward to it.
Thank you, Richard.
Thank you, Robert. Bye for now.
Bye for now.